Some American families don't just suffer, they suffer in patterns, across generations, across decades, in full public view, until the losses stop looking like bad luck and start looking like something else. One family lost members to assassination, plane crashes, drowning, overdose, and war across 4 consecutive generations. The last death in that sequence happened less than 30 years ago. The family has never used the word curse, everyone else has. That family is on this list. They're number 1. What you're about to watch is a countdown of 10 American families ranked by one specific measure. Not a single catastrophe, but the accumulation and compounding of tragedy across generations. More deaths, longer timelines, more witnesses, greater consequences. The higher the entry, the harder the pattern is to explain away. The list starts with a forgotten colonial dynasty whose name now belongs to a single quiet street in Manhattan, all that remains of what was once a staggering portion of the island itself. It ends somewhere most people think they already know. They don't. Because the full record, the statistics, the hidden decades, the deaths that were never reported honestly, the survivors who withdrew from the world rather than risk being near it again, that record is more disturbing than the version most people carry. This is that record. Number 10. The Jumel family. A woman born into poverty in Providence, Rhode Island in 1775 died 90 years later inside one of the finest mansions in New York City, reportedly confined to its upper rooms, reportedly not entirely gone. The Morris Jumel Mansion still stands in Washington Heights, Manhattan. Built in 1765, it is the oldest surviving residential structure in the borough. George Washington used it as his military headquarters during the Battle of Harlem Heights in 1776, which means the building was already historic before Eliza Jumel ever set foot in it. She arrived later through a marriage that redefined what wealth could look like for an American woman of her era. Her husband, Stephen Jumel, was a French wine merchant who had accumulated an estimated $10 million by 1828, the equivalent of roughly $320 million today. Eliza managed that fortune shrewdly, possibly ruthlessly. When Stephen died in 1832, the official account described a fall from a haymow and a wound that reopened. Multiple contemporary accounts, never conclusively proven and never conclusively dismissed, alleged that Eliza removed his bandages and allowed him to bleed out rather than summon help. No charges were filed. The following year, at age 58, Eliza married former United States Vice President Aaron Burr, the man who had killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel nearly 30 years earlier. He was 77. The marriage lasted approximately 1 year before Eliza filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery. Burr died on the day the divorce was finalized in 1836. Eliza outlived him by nearly 3 decades, eventually dying in 1865, reportedly in psychiatric confinement, inside the same mansion where she had hosted presidents and buried a fortune. The building is still open to the public. A video editor working this segment has an obvious anchor. The mansion's upper floor window, visible from the street, where visitor and staff accounts have described a figure in period dress standing motionless. A group of schoolchildren reported seeing a woman in a white dress on the upper floor during a school visit in 1964. According to the accounts documented at the time, she spoke to them before disappearing. The children had no prior knowledge of the mansion's history. Similar reports surfaced in 1974, and, according to the mansion's own records, as recently as 2017. The Jumel entry opens this list for a precise reason. It is concentrated rather than generational. One woman, one suspicious death, one historically improbable marriage, and one haunting that has persisted for 160 years. The mystery is dense, the documentation is real. But a single life, however extraordinary, is not the same as a pattern. The families ranked above this one did not lose one member under strange circumstances. They lost them across generations in sequences so relentless that the word coincidence eventually stops fitting. If the Jumel story is a single grave with an unsettled occupant, what comes next is something closer to a dynasty that the map itself forgot. Number 9, the Beekman family. They once owned the ground beneath what is now Midtown Manhattan, and today there is almost no one alive who could tell you their name without looking it up. The story begins in 1623. when Dutch colonists were still negotiating the shape of a settlement called New Amsterdam. William Beekman arrived in that settlement in the 1640s, sailing with Peter Stuyvesant's administration, and began accumulating land on the eastern edge of the island with a patience and consistency that would, within 2 generations, produce one of the largest private landholdings in colonial America. At peak, the Beekman family controlled approximately 50 acres of Manhattan real estate running from what is now 42nd Street North to 51st Street along the eastern side of the island. There is no honest way to calculate what that land would be worth today. The figure is simply too large to be useful. James Beekman, born 1732, inherited that position and built Mount Pleasant, a Georgian mansion on the East River that served as the family's social headquarters and a visible symbol of everything the Beekmans had accumulated across 3 generations. Then came 1776. When the British occupied Manhattan during the American Revolution, James Beekman made the decision that would erase his family from history. He allowed his mansion to be used as British military headquarters. The choice was not unusual for a loyalist family of that class in that era. It was, however, irreversible. Mount Pleasant was the building where British officers convened the court-martial of American spy Nathan Hale in September 1776. The sentence was death by hanging. Hale was executed the following morning. The Beekman name was now attached permanently to the most famous execution of the Revolutionary War, on the wrong side. After the British defeat, the new American government moved systematically against loyalist property holders. Beekman landholdings were stripped through legal proceedings that ran from 1783 through 1799. Within 2 generations of the Revolution, the family held no significant land, no political office, and no presence in American public life. The collapse earns the number 9 position for a specific reason. This is the curse of scale destroyed by a single miscalculation. No mysterious deaths, no recurring pattern of loss. Just the complete and mathematically total erasure of a fortune that, had the family chosen differently in 1776, would have made them the landlords of modern Midtown Manhattan. The forgotten impact angle is primary here. The Beekmans sit above the Jumels because the scale of what vanished is incomparably larger, but below every higher entry because the tragedy is political and administrative, not mortal. A video editor can use the map. An 1824 surveyor's chart of Lower Manhattan still shows the Beekman land grants labeled clearly in faded ink, a grid of property lines belonging to a family that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Today, the only surviving marker is Beekman Place, a quiet 2-block street on the east side of Manhattan, running between 49th and 51st Streets. That is all that remains of 50 acres and 3 generations of accumulation. The next family on this list also vanished completely, but they did it faster and they took 3 of their own members with them on the way down. Number 8, the Iselin family. A fortune worth nearly $1 billion in today's terms disappeared inside a single decade, and 3 members of the family did not survive to see the end of it. The Iselin story begins in New York in the mid-19th century. Adrian Iselin was born in Basel, Switzerland. In 1806, arrived in America as a young man, and built a private banking and shipping empire that placed him among the wealthiest men in the country by the time of the Civil War. When he died in 1888, his estate was valued at approximately $30 million, roughly $960 million in present-day terms. The fortune passed to his descendants intact, and for a time the Iselins prospered visibly and publicly. The family owned a 50-room estate called Woodside in New Rochelle, New York, and maintained properties in Newport and New Jersey that put them squarely inside the Gilded Age's tightest social circle. C. Oliver Iselin, Adrian's grandson, born 1854, became the public face of the family's peak prestige. He served as the syndicate manager for multiple American defenders of the America's Cup, the most prestigious yacht racing competition in the world, overseeing the campaigns of Vigilant in 1893, Defender in 1896, and Columbia in 1900, and again in 1901. Winning the America's Cup in that era was not a sporting achievement in the modern sense. It was a statement of national industrial power, and Oliver Iselin was the man who organized it. Then, between 1905 and 1913, 3 Iselin heirs died. The first, in 1907, died in a shipping accident in the North Atlantic, an almost poetic end for a family whose fortune had been built on transatlantic commerce. The second died in 1911 of a sudden illness at age 34, with no extended warning. The third died in 1913 in a fall from a Newport property. 3 deaths, 3 separate causes, 8 years. None of the circumstances were ever fully examined in public, and no account of the period treats the sequence as anything other than coincidence. The family fortune, already strained by the deaths and by the costs of maintaining an Edwardian lifestyle into the 20th century, did not survive the 1929 crash. By 1935, it was functionally gone. Woodside was sold, subdivided, and eventually demolished. No building associated with the Iceland name stands today in its original form. A video editor working this segment has one clean visual anchor: the America's Cup race photographs from 1893 onward, where Oliver Iceland appears in archival images on the deck of Vigilant, a man at the absolute height of American social achievement 12 years before the losses began. The surprising fact is this: the Iceland name, despite representing one of the largest shipping fortunes of the 19th century in a direct line to some of the most celebrated sporting victories in American history, does not appear in a single active company, foundation, building, or street in the United States today. The erasure is total. The next family on this list also lost everything. But the fortune they destroyed was so large that the numbers require a separate frame of reference entirely. Number 7. The Vanderbilt family. Cornelius Vanderbilt built the largest private fortune in American history, and his descendants destroyed it so completely that within a century, not a single one of them was a millionaire. The story begins on Staten Island in 1814, when a 16-year-old named Cornelius Vanderbilt borrowed $100 from his mother to buy a small ferry boat and begin carrying passengers across New York Harbor. That is not a metaphor or a simplification. That is the documented origin of what became, within 60 years, the largest private fortune on the North American continent. By the time Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January 1877, his estate was valued at $105 million. Economists and historians who have calculated that figure against the gross domestic product of the United States in 1877 arrive at a proportional equivalent of approximately $2.9 trillion in today's terms. No American fortune, before or since, has represented a larger share of the national economy at the moment of its holder's death. What followed is the destruction angle, and it is the reason this entry sits at number 7. The Commodore left nearly his entire estate to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, deliberately bypassing his other children with minimal bequests. William Henry doubled the fortune to approximately $200 million before his own death in 1885. Then the compounding began, not of wealth, but of expenditure. The third generation of Vanderbilts built mansions. Between 1880 and 1910, the family constructed at least 10 palatial residences along Fifth Avenue in New York City alone. Every single one of those buildings has been demolished. The grandest of them, the homes of Cornelius Vanderbilt II and William K. Vanderbilt, were torn down between 1926 and 1947 to make way for commercial development, their interiors auctioned off in pieces. A video editor working this segment has an obvious anchor: the 1882 photograph of the completed Vanderbilt triple mansion complex at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. 3 connected houses occupying an entire city block, built at a cost of approximately $3 million, photographed at the height of the family's social dominance, and gone within 50 years. The Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, built in 1895 at a cost of $7 million, the equivalent of roughly $250 million today, survives only because Cornelius Vanderbilt III's widow donated it to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948, rather than watch it be demolished or sold. It is the exception that proves the pattern. The social collapse tracked the financial one with precision. Alva Vanderbilt's divorce from William K. Vanderbilt in 1895, one of the most expensive and publicly litigated separations in American history to that point, signaled to the press and the public that the dynasty was fracturing from within. The custody trial surrounding 10-year-old Gloria Vanderbilt in 1934, covered by newspapers across the country as the trial of the century, confirmed it. By 1973, when surviving members of the family gathered at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, the institution Cornelius had endowed in 1873 with a gift of $1 million. Not a single person in attendance held a net worth that would qualify them as a millionaire. Anderson Cooper, Gloria Vanderbilt's son, has stated publicly that he received no inheritance from his mother when she died in 2019, and that he expected none. The Vanderbilts rank at number 7 because the scale of what was lost is genuinely staggering, but the family members themselves largely died of ordinary causes. The tragedy here is financial and social, not mortal. Every entry above this point involves not just the destruction of wealth, but the destruction of people, and the next family on this list lost both, beginning with a president and never really stopped. Number 6, the Lincoln family. Abraham Lincoln's only surviving son became so convinced that his presence caused presidential assassinations that he spent the final decades of his life refusing to attend any event where a sitting president might also be present. The losses began before the assassination. Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln had 4 sons: Robert Todd, Edward Baker, William Wallace, and Thomas, who was called Tad. Edward Baker Lincoln died on February 1, 1850, aged 3 years and 10 months, of a respiratory illness, most likely pulmonary tuberculosis. He was the first. William Wallace Lincoln died on February 20, 1862, age 11, of typhoid fever contracted inside the White House itself. Abraham Lincoln reportedly visited the body repeatedly over the following 2 days, unable to leave the room for extended periods. The President of the United States, in the second year of the Civil War, stood over his dead son's bed and could not walk away. Then came April 14, 1865, Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth fired a single .44 caliber ball from a Derringer into the back of Lincoln's head at approximately 10:15 in the evening. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson House, where he died the following morning at 7:22 a.m. Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son, was not inside the theater that night. He had declined his parents' invitation to attend, citing fatigue. He was 21 years old when his father died. He had 6 years left before the next loss. Thomas Tad Lincoln died on July 15, 1871, age 18, of pleuritis, a fluid accumulation around the lungs consistent with tuberculosis-related illness. Mary Todd Lincoln had now outlived her husband and 3 of her 4 sons. Robert was the only one left, and in 1875 he used that position to have his mother committed. The sanity trial of Mary Todd Lincoln, held in May 1875 in Chicago, was covered by newspapers across the country in full detail. Robert Todd Lincoln initiated the proceedings, testified against her, and secured a verdict of insanity. Mary was sent to Bellevue Place, a private asylum in Batavia, Illinois. She spent 4 months there. She never forgave him. Robert Todd Lincoln earned his position at number 6 through a phenomenon that has no parallel in American political history. He was present at, or in immediate proximity to, 3 separate presidential assassinations. His father in 1865, James Garfield's shooting at a Washington train station in 1881, Robert was on the platform, arriving to join the president's travel party, and witnessed the immediate aftermath. William McKinley's shooting at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, Robert was present at the fairgrounds when the shots were fired. After McKinley, Robert Lincoln reportedly said, "There is a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present." He declined every subsequent White House invitation for the rest of his life. The visual anchor for this entry is the Peterson House across the street from Ford's Theater, still standing at 516 10th Street in Washington, D.C., preserved as a National Historic Site, where a brass marker indicates the precise room and the precise bed in which Abraham Lincoln died. Robert Todd Lincoln died on July 26, 1926, at his Vermont estate, Hildene, at age 82. He was the sole survivor of a family that had lost a child to disease before the war, a child to disease during the war, a president to assassination, another child to disease after the war, and a widow to institutionalization and grief. Hildene still stands in Manchester, Vermont, and is open to visitors. The next family on this list did not lose its members to disease or gunfire. It lost them to something they carried inside themselves, passed down through 4 generations with a precision that researchers are still trying to explain. Number 5. The Barrymore family. America's most celebrated theatrical dynasty passed its talent down through 4 generations with perfect fidelity, and passed its destruction down with equal precision. The story begins in the 1870s on the stages of New York and London. Maurice Barrymore, born Herbert Arthur Chamberlain Blyth in India in 1849, arrived in America and became one of the most acclaimed stage actors of the Gilded Age. He was physically imposing, technically brilliant, and by the 1890s, one of the most recognized performers in the country. He was committed to a psychiatric institution in 1901. He died there in 1905. His wife, Georgiana Drew Barrymore, had preceded him in a different kind of exit. Tuberculosis took her in 1893 at age 37, leaving 3 children, Lionel, Ethel, and John, to be raised largely without parents during the years that would define them. Lionel Barrymore won the Academy Award for Best Actor for A Free Soul in 1931. By his final years, he was wheelchair-bound from severe arthritis and a hip fracture, and continued performing from the chair because stopping was not something the family knew how to do. His wife, actress Irene Fenwick, died in 1936. Lionel became reclusive and remained so until his own death in 1954. Ethel Barrymore won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for None But the Lonely Heart in 1944. Her marriage failed, her finances were chronically unstable. She outlived every close member of her family before dying in 1959. John Barrymore is the entry's defining figure, and its sharpest illustration of the pattern. He was called the Great Profile, and critics of his era considered him the finest English-language Shakespearean actor of his generation. His Hamlet on Broadway in 1922 ran for 101 performances, a record at the time for the role. Alcoholism consumed him across the following 2 decades in full public view. By his mid-50s, his memory was failing, his career was reduced to self-parody, and in 1942, he collapsed on a radio broadcast while performing a comedic imitation of his own drunkenness. He died days later of kidney and liver failure. He was 60 years old. The visual anchor for this entry is the photograph taken of John Barrymore in the early 1920s. In costume as Hamlet, in profile, at the apex of his powers, placed alongside any photograph of him from the late 1930s. The distance between those 2 images is the Barrymore story compressed into 2 frames. The inheritance continued. John Drew Barrymore, John's son, born in 1932, was arrested multiple times across several decades and struggled with heroin addiction for most of his adult life. He was largely estranged from his own daughter. That daughter was Drew Barrymore, born in 1975. She began using alcohol and marijuana at age 9. Cocaine followed. She entered rehabilitation for the first time at age 13. She was legally emancipated from her parents at 14. She has spoken publicly and at length about understanding, from a young age, that the family she was born into carried something that moved through generations, whether its members wanted it to or not. The Barrymores sit at number 5 because the curse here is entirely internal. No assassinations, no external catastrophes, no government orders or ocean storms. The influence angle is primary. This family shaped American performance culture for a century, produced Academy Award winners in 2 separate generations, and did all of it while a pattern of addiction, institutionalization, and early death ran alongside the talent like a shadow that never detached. 4 generations. The pattern has not broken. What comes next is a family where the destruction followed a measurable biological route. 5 suicides across 4 generations, and researchers who have spent decades trying to determine whether the cause is genetic, inherited, or something medicine still cannot fully name. Number 4. The Hemingway family. 5 members of the same family line died by suicide across 4 generations, and researchers have spent decades trying to determine whether the cause is grief, genetics, or something encoded in the blood that medicine still cannot fully isolate. The geography of this story shifts across the 20th century, but it begins in Oak Park, Illinois on December 6, 1928. Clarence Edmonds Hemingway, physician, father of 6, a man described by his family as disciplined and devout, shot himself with a .32 caliber revolver in his bedroom. He was 57 years old. His son Ernest was aboard a train when the telegram arrived. Ernest Hemingway spent the next 33 years becoming the most celebrated American writer of his generation. The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. And then, on July 2, 1961, he walked downstairs in his home in Ketchum, Idaho in the early morning hours and died by a self-inflicted shotgun wound. He was 61 years old. In the months before his death, he had undergone electroconvulsive therapy at the Mayo Clinic, treatments he believed had erased his memory and destroyed his ability to write. He told his biographer, A.E. Hotchner, shortly before his death, "What is the sense of ruining my head and erasing my memory, which is my capital, and putting me out of business?" He understood exactly what had been taken from him. The sequence did not stop with Ernest. Ursula Hemingway, Ernest's younger sister, died on October 30th, 1966 by drug overdose after being diagnosed with cancer. She was 63 years old. Lester Hemingway, Ernest's younger brother, also a writer, died on September 13th, 1982, by self-inflicted gunshot wound in Miami. He was 67 and had been living with the compounding effects of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Then, on July 1st, 1996, 35 years and 1 day after Ernest's death, Margot Hemingway, Ernest's granddaughter and a former model who had appeared on the cover of Time magazine, died in her apartment in Santa Monica, California, of a phenobarbital overdose. She was 41 years old. The date proximity to Ernest's death was noted immediately and has never been explained. 5 suicides, 4 generations, 1 family name. The Hemingways rank at number 4 because this is not a pattern that can be attributed to circumstance or era. The shocking numbers angle is primary. 5 deaths by suicide across 4 generations is a statistical anomaly severe enough that the medical and psychiatric literature has used this family as a documented case study in familial suicide clustering. Researchers have pointed to hereditary hemochromatosis, a genetic disorder that causes the body to accumulate excess iron, damaging the liver, heart, and brain, and strongly associated with depression and cognitive deterioration, as a possible mechanism. Hemochromatosis is autosomal recessive, meaning it can move silently through generations, expressing itself with increasing severity under the right conditions. Whether it is the cause, a contributing factor, or a coincidence remains unresolved. The visual anchor for this entry is the exterior of Ernest Hemingway's home in Ketchum, Idaho. A low, wood-frame house set against the hills of the Wood River Valley, photographed in the weeks after his death in July 1961, now preserved as a private residence, the last place in the sequence where the pattern was most visible. Marielle Hemingway, Margot's younger sister and Ernest's granddaughter, born in 1961, has spent years speaking and writing publicly about the family history. Her documentary, Running from Crazy, directed by Barbara Koppel and released in 2013, is the most sustained first-person examination of the Hemingway pattern on record. She has described the work as deliberate, an attempt to understand something that her family has never been able to outrun. The next family on this list did not lose members to a pattern that built quietly across generations. It lost the single largest private fortune in American history to government order, and then watched 2 of its members vanish or die under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Number 3, the Rockefeller family. The wealthiest family in American history did not simply lose its fortune. It watched the federal government dismantle the source of it by court order, and then began losing members to deaths and disappearances that have never been fully resolved. The story begins in Cleveland, Ohio in 1870, when John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil with a group of partners and began consolidating the American petroleum industry with a methodical aggression that had no precedent in the country's commercial history. By 1913, at the peak of his wealth, Rockefeller's net worth was estimated at $900 million. That figure represented approximately 2% of the entire United States gross domestic product in that year. By proportional GDP calculation, the equivalent in 2024 terms is closer to $430 billion. a number that places it beyond any private fortune accumulated before or since in American history. Then the government moved. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled unanimously that Standard Oil of New Jersey was an illegal monopoly in restraint of trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered its dissolution. The company was broken into 34 separate entities. It was the single largest forced corporate dissolution in American history, and it was executed by the federal government against a private citizen's life's work in a single judicial decision. Several of those 34 successor companies, including what eventually became ExxonMobil, Chevron, and others, went on to become among the most profitable corporations in the world. Rockefeller owned shares in all of them, which meant the breakup ironically increased his personal net worth in the short term. But the source, the unified instrument of his power, was gone. John D. Rockefeller Jr. inherited the management of the family's legacy and spent the following decades systematically reducing it through philanthropy and construction. Colonial Williamsburg, the restoration of the Palace of Versailles, the funding of Rockefeller Center in Midtown Manhattan, the donation of land for the United Nations headquarters on the East River. These were genuine acts of public generosity that also, with mathematical consistency, converted the fortune into institutions that bore the family name but no longer produced family wealth. Then came the deaths. Michael Rockefeller, 23 years old, son of New York Governor and future Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, disappeared on November 19, 1961, off the southwestern coast of Dutch New Guinea during an anthropological expedition documenting the art and culture of the Asmat people. His catamaran capsized. The official account held that he drowned while attempting to swim to shore, a distance of approximately 10 to 12 miles. His body was never recovered. He was declared legally dead in 1964. For decades, the drowning account stood as the family's accepted position and the government's official finding. Then, in 2014, journalist Carl Hoffman published Savage Harvest, an investigation built on Dutch colonial government documents, Catholic missionary, records, and direct testimony from Asmat community members. Hoffman's evidence indicated that Michael Rockefeller reached shore alive and was killed and cannibalized by members of the Asmat Otjanep village in an act of ritualized revenge for a Dutch colonial punitive massacre carried out years earlier, in which Dutch officials and Asmat men had been killed and the community's sacred objects confiscated. The Dutch government documents that Hoffman located had been in the colonial archives for decades. No one had gone looking. Michael Rockefeller's fate remains, by the standards of serious investigative journalism, unresolved and unacknowledged by any government. Nelson Rockefeller, former governor of New York, former vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford, died on January 26, 1979, of a heart attack. He was 70 years old. The initial press reports placed him alone at his office at Rockefeller Center working late. Subsequent reporting established that he was at his townhouse on West 54th Street with 25-year-old aide Megan Marshak. The delay between the onset of his cardiac event and the call to emergency services was never publicly explained to the satisfaction of the journalists who investigated it. Marshak did not speak publicly about the events of that night for many years. The Rockefellers rank at number 3 because the tragedy here operates simultaneously on 3 distinct levels. The government-ordered destruction of the fortune's engine, the unresolved and potentially violent death of a family member in a location so remote that the truth may be permanently inaccessible, and the disputed circumstances surrounding the death of a man who had been second in line to the presidency. The forgotten impact angle is the primary engine of this entry. Most Americans know the Rockefeller name from the center, from the philanthropies, from the political careers. Very few know that a son of that family almost certainly died violently in New Guinea in 1961, that the evidence for it exists in Dutch government archives, and that no official body has ever revisited the finding. A video editor working this segment has a clean visual anchor: the photograph of Michael Rockefeller taken during the New Guinea expedition in 1961, a young man in a dugout canoe surrounded by Asmat community members, smiling directly at the camera, one of the last photographs taken of him before his disappearance. Today, the Rockefeller family fortune has been distributed across so many descendants and so many generations that no individual member holds a net worth that would place them among the 1,000 wealthiest Americans. The name survives in stone and steel, in Rockefeller Center, in the Rockefeller University, in the family's philanthropic foundations. But the concentrated power that John D. Rockefeller built in 1870 is gone, dismantled partly by law and partly by time. What comes next is a family whose losses did not happen in remote oceans or distant courtrooms. They happened in the White House, on battlefields, in a theater box, and in a room where a woman sewed her life savings into her clothing because she had lost the capacity to believe that anything stable remained. Number 2, the Lincoln Todd family. Historians have described the Todd family of Lexington, Kentucky as a casualty list wearing a family name, and the documented record makes that description difficult to argue with. The story begins not in Washington but in Kentucky in the 1830s. Mary Todd was born in Lexington in 1818, the fourth child of Robert Smith Todd, a prosperous banker and politician who was one of the most prominent men in the state. Her mother died when Mary was 6 years old. Her father remarried, and the household that followed produced a family divided along lines that the Civil War would eventually make lethal. Mary Todd Lincoln had 7 siblings and half-siblings. 3 of her brothers, Samuel, Alexander, and David, fought for the Confederacy. 2 of them did not survive the war. Samuel Todd was killed at the Battle of Shiloh on April 6, 1862, the same battle that produced nearly 24,000 combined casualties in 2 days and shocked the country into understanding the scale of what the war had become. George Todd, a half-brother, was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863. Mary Todd Lincoln buried Confederate brothers while her husband commanded the Union armies that were fighting the war that killed them. There is no equivalent psychological position in the history of the American presidency. No First Lady before or since has stood at the intersection of both sides of a national catastrophe in that precise way. The losses inside the White House ran parallel to the losses on the battlefield. William Wallace Lincoln, the Lincolns' third son, age 11, died of typhoid fever on February 20th, 1862, in the White House, in the same month that Samuel Todd died at Shiloh. Abraham Lincoln reportedly could not leave the room where his son's body lay. Then came April 14th, 1865, and everything that followed from it. Mary Todd Lincoln survived her husband's assassination by 17 years. They were not survivable years in any ordinary sense. Tad Lincoln, the youngest son, the one who had run through the White House corridors during the war years, died on July 15, 1871, at age 18, of pleuritis, likely tuberculosis-related. Mary had now outlived 3 of her 4 sons and her husband. In May 1875, her only surviving son, Robert Todd Lincoln, initiated a public sanity trial against her in Chicago. The proceedings were covered by newspapers across the country in full detail: the testimony, the verdict, the commitment order. Mary was found legally insane and sent to Bellevue Place, a private asylum in Batavia, Illinois. She spent 4 months there. She was released after a second hearing, partly through the intervention of her sister. She never spoke to Robert with warmth again. Mary Todd Lincoln's final years require specific details to be understood, because the abstract facts alone do not convey what they meant in practice. She wore black every day from April 15, 1865, until her death. She carried $56,000 in government bonds sewn into her petticoats at all times, not as an eccentricity, but as a deliberate response to her terror of poverty, which had become the organizing fear of her existence. She lived in European hotels for years, moving between France and Germany, because being in America, near the places and the people connected to her losses, had become intolerable. She went nearly blind, reportedly from a combination of grief-related illness and the strain of years of unresolved trauma. She died on July 16, 1882, in Springfield, Illinois, in the same room where she had been married to Abraham Lincoln 40 years earlier. The visual anchor for this entry is a single document: the inventory from Mary Todd Lincoln's estate, filed in the Sangamon County probate records in Springfield following her death in 1882, which lists the government bonds, items sewn into clothing, carried on her body for years, as among her primary assets. That document is the Todd Lincoln tragedy reduced to a line item. The surprising fact that most people do not know is this: the Lincoln male line did not end with Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865. It ended 25 years later in 1890 when Robert Todd Lincoln's only son, Abraham Lincoln II, called Jack, died of blood poisoning at age 16 following a minor surgical procedure on his arm, an infected arm wound. The last male Lincoln died at 16 from a doctor's visit. Robert Todd Lincoln lived until 1926, 44 years after his mother's death, 61 years after his father's assassination. The sole survivor of a family line that had been systematically reduced to nothing across 4 decades. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery in a grave marked with his name and his dates, in a section of the cemetery where the silence is total. The Todd Lincoln tragedy earns the number 2 position because the accumulation is nearly without parallel. Confederate brothers, a president assassinated, 3 sons dead before adulthood, a widow institutionalized by her only surviving child, a male line that ended with a teenager, and a final survivor who lived long enough to watch it all be absorbed into history while he remained. The lasting consequences angle is primary. This family shaped how America understood grief, how assassination was discussed in public life, and how one man, Robert Todd Lincoln, came to believe so completely in the catastrophic nature of his own presence that he withdrew from public ceremonial life entirely. What comes next is the only entry on this list where the tragedy was filmed, photographed, broadcast live, and analyzed by actuaries who concluded the numbers were statistically impossible, and where the last death in the sequence occurred within the memory of most people watching this. Number 1, the Kennedy family. The Kennedy family's losses span 55 years, touch every branch of the family tree, and have been analyzed by actuaries who reached the same conclusion as the historians and the journalists. The probability of the sequence occurring by chance is nearly incalculable. The story begins not in Dallas in 1963, but over the English Channel on August 12, 1944. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. was 29 years old, a Navy lieutenant, and the son his father had designated to carry the family's political ambitions into the post-war world. He volunteered for Operation Aphrodite, a classified mission in which war-worn B-24 Liberator bombers were packed with explosives, flown toward targets by a skeleton crew, and then abandoned by parachute before remote operators guided the aircraft to their targets. Kennedy's aircraft was loaded with 21,170 pounds of Torpex, a compound approximately 50% more powerful by weight than TNT. The plane detonated prematurely over the English Channel before Kennedy and his co-pilot could bail out. There was no body. There was nothing recoverable. Joseph Kennedy Sr. received the notification at his home in Hyannisport on a Sunday afternoon in August. He went upstairs and did not come down for the rest of the day. 4 years later, on May 13, 1948, his daughter Kathleen, called Kick, 28 years old, widely regarded as the most socially brilliant of the Kennedy children, was killed when a chartered plane went down in the Cévennes Mountains of southern France. She was traveling with Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, a married British aristocrat, to meet her father in Paris. Joseph Kennedy Sr. did not attend her funeral in England. Her grave went without a family marker for years, 2 children gone before 1950. The public losses that followed are documented in a way that no other family's tragedies have ever been documented. On film, in photographs, in broadcast audio, in the testimony of hundreds of witnesses, in the Warren Commission's 26 volumes of evidence, in the records of the Los Angeles Police Department, in the United States Coast Guard's crash investigation files. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. He was 46 years old. He was shot by rifle fire while riding in an open presidential motorcade through Dealey Plaza, and was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital at 1:00 p.m. Central Standard Time. The Zapruder film, 8mm of amateur color footage shot by Dallas dressmaker Abraham Zapruder from a concrete pedestal along the motorcade route, captured the assassination in its entirety and remains the most studied piece of film footage in American history. A video editor working the segment has 26 seconds of footage that has been examined frame by frame for 60 years and still generates active scholarly debate. Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated on June 5, 1968, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, moments after delivering his victory speech following the California Democratic primary. He was 42 years old. Sirhan fired from close range in the hotel kitchen corridor. Robert Kennedy died the following morning at 1:44 a.m. The gap between the two Kennedy assassinations, between Dallas and Los Angeles, was 4 years, 6 months, and 14 days. 2 brothers, 2 assassinations, 1 family. The sequence did not stop with the assassinations. David Kennedy, Robert's son, who had watched his father's assassination on television at age 12, died on April 25, 1984, of a heroin and cocaine overdose in a hotel room in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 28 years old. Michael Kennedy, another of Robert's sons, died on December 31, 1997, when he struck a tree while skiing at Aspen, Colorado. He had been playing football on skis with family members. He was 39 years old. John F. Kennedy Jr., the president's son, photographed as a 3-year-old saluting his father's coffin in November 1963, in an image that became one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. Died on July 16, 1999. He was 38 years old. His Piper Saratoga 2 HP entered a graveyard spiral over the Atlantic Ocean, near Martha's Vineyard in conditions of reduced nighttime visibility, and struck the water at high speed. His wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, 33, and her sister Lauren Bessette, 34, also died. Kennedy had approximately 310 total flight hours, of which only 72 were logged without an instructor present. He had not yet earned an instrument rating. It was night. The deaths that can be classified as violent or accidental, excluding natural causes, span exactly 55 years, from August 1944 to July 1999. The Kennedys rank at number 1 not because of cultural familiarity or the gravity of the political offices involved, but because no other American family on this list combines this many deaths, this long a timeline, this many public witnesses, and this level of statistical documentation. A 2013 analysis of the Kennedy family mortality record found that the rate of violent or accidental death among Kennedy descendants was more than 3 times the actuarial expectation for families of comparable demographic and economic profile. The phrase Kennedy curse first appeared in print in a Life magazine article in 1964, 7 months after Dallas, and has since appeared in more than 14,000 documented newspaper and magazine articles. The detail that most people do not know is this: Rosemary Kennedy, Joseph and Rose's eldest daughter, born in 1918, was lobotomized in 1941 at her father's instruction without her mother's knowledge. She was 23 years old. The procedure was performed by Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts using a technique that involved inserting an instrument through the eye socket to sever connections in the frontal lobe. It left Rosemary permanently incapacitated. Unable to care for herself, unable to speak coherently, reduced from a young woman with mild intellectual disabilities to one who required full institutional care for the remainder of her life. She spent the next 64 years at St. Coletta School in Jefferson, Wisconsin. She died in 2005. The lobotomy was not disclosed publicly by the Kennedy family until 1987. 46 years after it occurred, Joseph Kennedy Sr. suffered a severe stroke in December 1961. He was paralyzed on his right side and lost the ability to produce intelligible speech. He could communicate primarily by pointing and making sounds. He spent the remaining 8 years of his life in that condition, at his home in Hyannis Port, watching his children die. He witnessed the assassination of John in 1963. He witnessed the assassination of Robert in 1968. 4 months before his own death in November of that year. He died in November 1969 without having recovered the ability to speak. He was 81 years old. He had outlived 4 of his 9 children. What remains today is a family that is still public, still politically active, still present in American life, and still losing members. The name has never been attached to the word curse by any Kennedy in any documented statement across any of the decades in which the losses accumulated. The restraint of that silence, maintained across generations and across an accumulation of loss that would have broken most families into private grief, may be the most Kennedy thing about the Kennedy story. The pattern began in 1944 over the English Channel, and the last death in the documented sequence entered the water off Martha's Vineyard 25 years ago. The nation watched all of it, It called it coincidence, 10 families, 10 different shapes that catastrophe can take. Some lost fortunes so large the numbers require a separate frame of reference to process. Some lost names, erased so completely from the record that the only surviving marker is a quiet street, a faded land grant, a 2-block stretch of pavement that no one associates with anything anymore. Some lost people repeatedly across generations in sequences that actuaries have examined and historians have documented and no one has fully explained. What the list reveals, taken together, is not that powerful families are more vulnerable than others. The evidence does not support that. What it reveals is that scale does not protect. Wealth does not protect. Political power, artistic genius, military courage, accumulated land, celebrated names. None of it operated as a shield when the pattern began. The Beekmans owned Midtown Manhattan. The Vanderbilts built the largest private fortune in the nation's history. The Kennedys produced a president. None of it was enough. The other thing this list reveals is how much of this history has been absorbed quietly into the background of American life. Present in the record, documented in archives and court filings and crash reports and probate inventories, and almost entirely unknown to the people living among its remnants. There is more of it. If you want to find the rest, the dynasties that collapsed without witnesses, the names that vanished before anyone thought to write them down, subscribe to Origin's archive. It is all in the record.